Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Computer Scientist. Tonight we're drifting back to the early 1990s, to a time when the video game industry stood at a crossroads. A moment when one man believed he could revolutionize gaming forever with a single ambitious vision. A vision that would ultimately produce the most expensive mainstream console ever launched. The 3DO Interactive Multiplayer. A machine that cost $700 when it debuted. $700 in 1993, which would be well over $1,000 in today's money. This is not just a story about a failed console, it's a story about ambition, about technology pushing boundaries, about business models that seemed brilliant on paper but crumbled in reality. It's about the gap between what engineers dream of creating and what consumers are willing to pay for. And it's about a pivotal moment in gaming history that taught the industry lessons it would never forget. If you enjoy these deep dives into computing and gaming history, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, settle in. Let your mind wander back to the early 90s, and let's explore the fascinating, tragic story of the 3DO. To understand the 3DO, we must first understand the man behind it. Trip Hawkins, born William Murray. Hawkins III in 1953. Trip was not your typical Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He was a visionary who saw the future of entertainment long before most people even owned a personal computer. As a young man at Harvard, he designed his own major, combining business strategy with computer science and game theory. Even then, in the early 1970s, he was thinking about how computers would one day transform play into something far beyond simple diversion. After graduating, Hawkins joined Apple Computer in 1978, becoming one of its earliest employees. He worked directly with Steve Jobs and witnessed firsthand the birth of the personal computer revolution. But Hawkins didn't see computers as just productivity tools or business machines. He saw them as entertainment devices. He saw them as the future of games. And by 1982, he had grown restless. Apple wasn't moving fast enough into entertainment. Jobs was focused on changing how people worked, not how they played. So Hawkins left Apple and founded Electronic Arts. Yes, that Electronic Arts. The company that would become one of the largest video game publishers in the world. But in 1982, EA was just a startup with a radical idea. Hawkins believed that game developers should be treated like artists, like musicians or filmmakers. He put their names on the box. He photographed them like rock stars. He gave them creative control. This was revolutionary at a time when most game developers were anonymous programmers locked away in corporate cubicles. Under Hawkins' leadership, Electronic Arts grew rapidly throughout the 1980s. The company published hit after hit. Archon, MULE, One-on-One Basketball, Skate or Die, Populous. By the end of the decade, EA was a powerhouse, and Hawkins had proven he understood the gaming market better than almost anyone. But success at EA wasn't enough for him. He was already thinking about the next revolution. By the late 1980s, Hawkins had become convinced that the traditional console model was broken. Look at the landscape. Nintendo dominated with the NES, and soon the Super Nintendo. Sega was fighting back with the Genesis. But both companies controlled everything about their platforms. They manufactured the hardware. They decided which games could be published. They took enormous licensing fees from third-party developers. Hawkins saw this as a stranglehold that limited innovation and kept prices artificially high. He imagined something different, a new kind of entertainment system that would be open like the PC market. Multiple manufacturers could produce the hardware, competing on price and features. Game developers could publish freely without needing approval from a single corporate gatekeeper. The system would be powerful enough to deliver the next generation of multimedia entertainment, combining video games with movies, music, education, and interactive experiences we hadn't even imagined yet. This wasn't just about making another game console. Hawkins envisioned a device that would sit at the center of your living room and replace multiple entertainment devices. It would play games, yes, but also music CDs, photo CDs, interactive movies, educational software. It would be the bridge between the computer revolution and home entertainment. In his mind, this was the logical evolution of media itself. The television had revolutionized the 1950s. The VCR had revolutionized the 1970s. Now, in the 1990s, interactive multimedia would revolutionize everything. By 1990, Hawkins began quietly working on this vision, while still at EA. He assembled a small team of engineers and started researching what the technology would need to deliver this dream. CD-ROM was clearly the future. The compact disc could hold hundreds of times more data than a cartridge, and it was already becoming the standard for music and computer software. It was cheap to manufacture, easy to distribute, and consumers were already familiar with it. The system would need to be powerful, far more powerful than the 16-bit consoles currently on the market. It would need true 32-bit processing to handle complex graphics and full-motion video. It would need dedicated hardware for playing audio CDs and decompressing video. It would need expansion capabilities so it could grow with technology. Most importantly, it would need to be affordable enough for mainstream adoption, while being powerful enough to justify its existence. By 1991, Hawkins had made his decision. He would leave Electronic Arts, the company he had built from nothing, and dedicate himself fully to this new venture. On August 12, 1991, he officially resigned from EA. The announcement shocked the industry. Hawkins was leaving at the peak of EA's success to chase a dream that many thought was impossible. But he was convinced. He had seen the future, and he was determined to build it. Hawkins founded the 3DO company in September 1991. The name stood for Three-Dimensional Operating System, though in reality the system wasn't truly three-dimensional in the way we think of modern 3D graphics. But the name suggested depth, sophistication, a leap beyond the flat, two-dimensional gaming of the past. It suggested something new, something revolutionary. He immediately began recruiting. He needed hardware engineers who could build a machine powerful enough to deliver on his vision. He needed software engineers who could create an operating system that was flexible and expandable. He needed business minds who could navigate the complex world of licensing deals and manufacturing partnerships. And he needed investors who believed in a vision that flew in the face of conventional wisdom. The pitch was compelling. Instead of following the traditional console model where one company manufactures the hardware and takes all the risk, 3DO would license its technology to multiple manufacturers. Companies like Panasonic, Sanyo, and Gold Star could produce their own versions of the 3DO, just as multiple companies manufactured VCRs and CD players. They would compete on price, features, and quality, driving innovation and keeping costs down for consumers. 3DO would make its money from licensing fees, not hardware sales. Every manufacturer would pay 3DO a royalty for each unit sold. Game developers would also pay licensing fees, but these would be much lower than what Nintendo and Sega charged. The result would be an open ecosystem where innovation thrived and consumers benefited from competition. Hawkins secured initial funding relatively easily. His track record at EA opened doors, and his vision attracted believers. Time Warner, AT&T, Matsushita, and other major corporations invested. By early 1992, 3DO had significant capital and was moving forward rapidly. The hardware was taking shape in labs. The operating system was being coded, partnerships were being formed, and the gaming industry was starting to pay attention. The technical specifications of the 3DO were, for 1993, genuinely impressive. This was not an incremental upgrade over existing consoles. This was a generational leap. The system featured a 32-bit ARM60 RISC processor running at 12.5 MHz. While that clock speed might not sound impressive today, the ARM architecture was far more efficient than the processors in competing consoles. It could execute more instructions per clock cycle, making it significantly more powerful than its specifications suggested. The system included dedicated graphics hardware, with 2 custom video chips that could push impressive visuals for the era. It could display 16.7 million colors simultaneously, far beyond what the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis could manage. The resolution could go up to 640 by 480 pixels, though most games ran at lower resolutions to maintain performance. But even at lower resolutions, the color depth and visual fidelity were stunning compared to what gamers were used to. For 3D graphics, which were still in their infancy in the console world, the 3DO used a custom graphics processor that could handle texture mapping and basic 3D rendering. It wasn't as capable as dedicated 3D hardware that would come later, but for 1993, it was remarkable. Games could now feature polygonal graphics with textures instead of the flat-shaded or pre-rendered sprites that dominated the era. Audio was another area where 3DO excelled. The system could play standard audio CDs, making it a legitimate CD player in addition to a gaming device. For game audio, it featured a custom digital signal processor that could handle 44.1 kHz, 16-bit stereo sound. This was CD-quality audio, the same fidelity as commercial music CDs. Games could feature fully orchestrated soundtracks, voice acting, and sound effects with a richness that cartridge-based systems simply couldn't match. Memory was generous for the time. The system came with 2 MB of DRAM, 1 MB of RAM for graphics, and a small amount of NVRAM for saving game data and system settings. This might seem tiny by modern standards, but in 1993 this was substantial. The large memory pool allowed for detailed textures, smooth animation, and complex game logic without the constant loading and limitations that plagued earlier systems. The CD-ROM drive was the heart of the system. It operated at double speed, meaning it could read data twice as fast as standard CD-ROM drives of the time. This reduced loading times and allowed games to stream data continuously, enabling larger game worlds and more detailed assets. The CD format meant games could be enormous by 1993 standards, with some titles filling the entire 650 megabyte capacity of the disk. The 3DO's operating system was called Opera, and it was surprisingly sophisticated. Unlike the simple firmware of previous consoles, Opera was a real operating system with multitasking capabilities, a file system, and a standardized API for developers. Games could run background tasks while the player was focused on something else. The system could handle multiple data streams simultaneously, crucial for games that combined full motion video with interactive elements. Expansion was built into the design from the beginning. The system featured a high-speed expansion port that could accept various add-ons. While most of these expansion devices never materialized, the architecture was there. Engineers envisioned future modules for enhanced graphics, network connectivity, and even virtual reality. The 3DO was designed to evolve, to grow more capable as technology advanced. The controller was unconventional but thoughtful. Instead of the typical two-controller setup, the 3DO shipped with a single controller that had a pass-through port. You could daisy-chain up to 8 controllers together, each plugging into the previous one. The controller itself featured the standard directional pad and 4 action buttons, plus left and right shoulder buttons, and 3 additional buttons for system functions. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was comfortable and functional. The industrial design of the early units was sleek and sophisticated. Panasonic, as the first manufacturer to bring a 3DO to market, created a black compact unit that looked more like high-end audio equipment than a toy. It had a smooth, curved design with a top-loading CD tray. The front panel featured minimal controls: power, open, close, and a headphone jack with volume control. It looked expensive. It looked premium. It looked like it belonged in an adult entertainment center, not a child's bedroom. But building this technology came at a cost. The components were expensive. The CD-ROM drive alone was costly to manufacture at the required specifications. The custom chips had to be fabricated in relatively small quantities, which drove up per-unit costs. The licensing model meant that manufacturers like Panasonic had to pay royalties to 3DO, which they needed to recoup through higher retail prices, and everyone involved wanted to make a profit. By mid-1993, as the launch approached, the pricing discussions grew tense. 3DO's business plan had initially suggested a retail price of around $500, which was already high compared to the $200 consoles from Nintendo and Sega. But as manufacturing costs became clear, that target seemed impossible. Panasonic, responsible for the first production run, calculated that they would need to charge significantly more just to break even, let alone make a profit. The internal debates were fierce. Some executives argued that the 3DO should be positioned as a premium product, marketed to affluent early adopters who would pay extra for cutting-edge technology. Others worried that any price over $500 would doom the system to obscurity, limiting it to a tiny niche while competitors captured the mainstream market. Hawkins himself remained optimistic, believing that the technology would speak for itself and that once people saw what the 3DO could do, price would become secondary. Ultimately, the decision was made. The Panasonic 3DO interactive multiplayer would launch in October '93, with a retail price of $699.19 in the United States, $700, nearly double the initial target, and more than triple the cost of a Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis. It was by far the most expensive mainstream gaming console ever released to that point in history. The reaction within the industry was immediate and mixed. Some praised 3DO's ambition and recognized the value in the technology. Others predicted disaster, pointing out that no console had ever succeeded at such a high price point. The gaming press was intrigued but skeptical, and consumers, when they heard the price, were shocked. $700 for a video game system? In 1993, that was serious money. That was a mortgage payment. That was a month's rent. That was half the price of a decent used car. But Trip Hawkins remained confident. He had been right before about the future of gaming. He had built Electronic Arts into a giant by betting on developers and treating games as art. Now he was betting on multimedia, on open standards, on the idea that consumers would pay for quality and power. The 3DO was not just another console. It was the first step into a new era of entertainment, or at least that's what they believed as they prepared for launch. The reality would prove far more complicated. To truly appreciate what the 3DO represented, we need to dig deeper into its hardware and understand just how advanced it was for 1993. This wasn't marketing hyperbole or empty promises. The 3DO was genuinely pushing boundaries, incorporating technology that wouldn't become standard in consoles for years. The engineers behind it weren't just building a game machine, they were trying to build the future. The heart of the system was the ARM60 processor, and this choice was significant. ARM, which stood for Advanced RISC Machine, was a relatively new architecture at the time. It had been developed by Acorn Computers in the UK and was primarily used in specialized applications and embedded systems. Most consoles used custom chips from companies like Motorola or NEC, processors designed specifically for gaming. But 3DO chose ARM for its efficiency and scalability. RISC, or reduced instruction set computing, was a philosophy that favored simpler, more streamlined processor designs over the complex instruction sets of traditional CPUs. An ARM processor could execute fewer types of instructions than a traditional processor, but each instruction ran much faster and more efficiently. This meant that even at a relatively modest 12.5 MHz, the ARM60 could outperform processors with higher clock speeds but less efficient architectures. The ARM60 in the 3DO was a 32-bit processor, which meant it could work with data in much larger chunks than the 16-bit processors in the Super Nintendo and Genesis. This dramatically improved its ability to handle complex calculations, work with large amounts of memory, and process graphics data. For 3D graphics in particular, which required constant mathematical transformations of polygon coordinates, the 32-bit architecture provided a substantial advantage. But the CPU alone wasn't enough to deliver the visuals 3DO promised. The system included two custom graphics chips, both designed specifically for multimedia applications. The first was called the CEL engine, which stood for Control Engine and Video DRAM Logic. This chip handled sprite rendering, video playback, and most 2D graphics operations. It could move and manipulate hundreds of sprites simultaneously, blend layers of graphics together, and decompress video data in real time. The second graphics chip was the SPORT, or serial port, which handled data transfer between the various components of the system. While not strictly a graphics processor, the SPORT was crucial for maintaining smooth performance. It acted as a high-speed bus connecting the CPU, the graphics hardware, the audio system, and the CD-ROM drive. Data could flow between these components without bogging down the main processor, allowing multiple operations to happen simultaneously. For 3D graphics, the 3DO used a software-based rendering system that ran on the main processor and graphics chips working together. There wasn't a dedicated 3D accelerator like later systems would have. Instead, the system relied on optimized code libraries that developers could use to calculate 3D transformations and render polygons. This approach was flexible, allowing developers to optimize for their specific needs, but it also meant 3D performance varied significantly between games depending on how well the code was written. The color capabilities of the 3DO were particularly impressive. The system could display images with 24-bit color depth, which meant 8 bits each for red, green, and blue channels. This yielded over 16 million possible colors. In comparison, the Super Nintendo could display 256 colors simultaneously from a palette of 32,668, and the Genesis was even more limited. The visual difference was striking. 3DO games could feature subtle color gradients, realistic skin tones, and detailed textures that simply weren't possible on older hardware. The audio system was equally advanced. The 3DO featured a custom DSP, or digital signal processor, dedicated entirely to audio. This chip could decompress audio data, mix multiple sound channels, apply effects like reverb and echo, and output stereo sound at CD quality. Most impressively, it could do all of this while barely touching the main CPU, leaving processing power available for game logic and graphics. Games could use this audio hardware in creative ways. Some titles featured fully orchestrated soundtracks recorded in professional studios with live instruments and professional vocalists. Others used extensive voice acting, with character dialogue throughout the game. A few experimental titles even featured interactive music that changed dynamically based on player actions, layering and mixing audio tracks in real time to match the on-screen action. The CD-ROM drive, while technically just a double-speed unit, was crucial to the 3DO's capabilities. The drive could read data at 300 kilobytes per second, which doesn't sound like much today but was substantial for 1993. More importantly, the drive could seek relatively quickly and handle constant streaming of data. This allowed games to continuously load assets from disk while maintaining gameplay, reducing the need for loading screens and enabling much larger game worlds than cartridge systems could support. The operating system, Opera, was perhaps the most forward-thinking aspect of the entire platform. Unlike previous consoles that had simple boot code and left everything else to individual games, Opera provided a rich software environment. It included a microkernel operating system, a file system that treated the CD like a hierarchical directory structure, standardized APIs for accessing hardware, and libraries for common gaming functions like sprite manipulation, sound playback, and 3D math. Developers could write code that ran on top of Opera, using its services instead of directly accessing hardware. This made development easier and more consistent between different manufacturers' versions of the 3DO. A game written for the Panasonic unit would run identically on a Gold Star unit, because they were both running the same Opera OS. This was a level of software standardization that previous consoles had never attempted. Opera also enabled features that were unusual for consoles in 1993. The system could multitask, running background processes while a game was playing. This allowed for features like background music that continued even when switching between game and system menus. The OS handled memory management automatically, allocating and freeing memory as needed, rather than requiring games to manage every byte manually. And it included security features to prevent piracy, though these would ultimately prove ineffective. The expansion port on the back of the 3DO was designed to be future-proof. It was a high-speed serial interface capable of transferring data at rates far exceeding what was needed for peripherals of the time. The idea was that as technology advanced, new modules could be created to expand the system's capabilities. Engineers discussed possibilities like modem adapters for online gaming, video capture cards, even VR headsets. The architecture was there, ready and waiting for accessories that mostly never materialized. One expansion that did exist was the MPEG video card, a module that added hardware acceleration for playing MPEG-1 video. This turned the 3DO into a capable video playback device, able to play full-length movies from video CD format. While video CD never became popular in the United States, in parts of Asia it was a significant format, and the 3DO's ability to play these movies added value for consumers in those markets. The controller, while not technologically revolutionary, showed thoughtful design. The daisy chain connection system was elegant, eliminating the need for a multi-tap accessory and allowing players to add controllers without routing cables back to the console. The button layout was comfortable, with 6 action buttons arranged for easy access. The D-pad was responsive, and the shoulder buttons, which were still relatively new to console controllers, felt natural to use. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of the controller was the headphone jack on its face. You could plug headphones directly into the controller and listen to game audio privately. The controller had its own volume dial, allowing players to adjust sound without touching the system or the TV. This might seem minor, but it showed 3DO's attention to user experience. They were thinking about how people actually use gaming systems in their homes, where volume could be an issue late at night or in shared living spaces. From a pure technology standpoint, the 3DO was remarkable. It represented a genuine leap forward, incorporating ideas and components that were ahead of their time. The problem wasn't the hardware itself, which was legitimately impressive. The problem was that impressive hardware came at a cost, and that cost was about to become the defining characteristic of the entire platform. When the Panasonic 3DO launched in October 1993, consumers didn't see a revolutionary multimedia device. They saw a $700 video game console, and that price would cast a shadow over everything the 3DO tried to accomplish. $700. Let's talk about what that meant in 1993. To put this in perspective, the average American household earned about $31,000 per year. $700 represented over 2% of an entire year's income for a typical family. It was not an impulse purchase. It was not even a considered purchase for most people. It was, for the vast majority of consumers, completely out of reach. Compare this to the competition. In 1993, you could buy a brand new Sega Genesis with Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for about $150. A Super Nintendo with Super Mario World ran around $200. Even if you wanted to go all out and buy both systems with several games each, you would still spend less than the cost of a single 3DO console with no games. The price disparity wasn't just significant, it was overwhelming. To make matters worse, games for the 3DO weren't cheap either. While cartridge games typically retailed for $50 to $70 due to manufacturing costs, CD-based games should theoretically have been much cheaper to produce. CDs cost pennies to manufacture compared to the dollars required for ROM chips and cartridge shells. But 3DO games launched at prices between $50 and $75, sometimes higher for special editions. The cost savings of CD-ROM were not being passed along to consumers. The pricing strategy revealed a fundamental tension at the heart of the 3DO business model. Panasonic, as a manufacturer, needed to recoup their production costs and make a profit on each unit sold. But they also had to pay licensing fees to 3DO Company for every console they manufactured. This cut into their margins significantly. To make the economics work, they had to price the system higher than they probably wanted to. 3DO Company, meanwhile, made their money from those licensing fees. They needed manufacturers to produce units, and they needed software developers to create games. Both groups paid royalties to 3DO. This model worked well if adoption was high. If millions of units sold, even small per-unit fees would generate substantial revenue. But it created a chicken-and-egg problem. High prices limited adoption, which limited revenue, which made it harder to reduce prices. Trip Hawkins defended the pricing publicly, arguing that the 3DO was not just a gaming console but a complete multimedia system. "Look at what you're getting," he would say in interviews. "This plays games, yes, but it also plays audio CDs, photo CDs, and video CDs with the proper expansion. It's a next-generation entertainment center that will replace multiple devices in your home. When you consider everything it does, $700 is actually quite reasonable." This argument had some merit in theory. If you were planning to buy a CD player, a gaming console, and a video CD player separately, the costs would add up. The 3DO, in theory, consolidated these purchases. But this logic ignored human psychology and market reality. Consumers didn't buy consoles based on theoretical value propositions. They bought them to play games, and for playing games, $700 was an impossible sell for most families. The target audience had to shift by necessity. If mainstream families couldn't afford the 3DO, then it needed to appeal to affluent early adopters, tech enthusiasts who wanted the bleeding edge, professionals with disposable income who appreciated cutting-edge technology, collectors who needed to own every console. This became the de facto marketing strategy, though it was never quite articulated explicitly. Retail stores struggled with how to position the 3DO. In most stores, gaming consoles sat in the toy department or the electronics section alongside televisions and stereos, usually near the lower-priced items. But a $700 console didn't fit there. Some retailers placed it in premium positions, near high-end audio equipment or computers. Others created special displays highlighting its multimedia capabilities. A few stores put it behind glass in locked cases, treating it like expensive jewelry rather than a consumer electronic device. The gaming press was conflicted about how to cover the 3DO's price. Reviews of the hardware itself were generally positive. Magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, and Next Generation praised its technical capabilities, its CD-quality audio, its impressive graphics. But every review included a lengthy discussion of the price, and that discussion was never encouraging. Even reviewers who loved the system acknowledged that $700 would prevent most gamers from ever experiencing it. Some publications tried to reframe the price as an investment. If you're serious about gaming, they argued, the 3DO represents the future. Better to spend more now and be positioned for the next generation than to buy an aging 16-bit system that would be obsolete soon. But even sympathetic reviewers admitted this was a tough sell. Most gamers, especially younger ones, simply didn't have that kind of money available for entertainment. Consumer reaction was often visceral. Gaming forums and early online communities were filled with disbelief when the price was announced. $700 for a console? That's insane. That's price gouging. No one will buy it at that price. The skepticism was widespread and immediate. Even people who were intrigued by the technology and impressed by what they had seen in demonstrations balked at the price tag. There were, of course, people who did buy the 3DO at launch. Early adopters always exist for new technology, and the 3DO had features that appealed to this group. Wealthy gamers who wanted bragging rights, technology enthusiasts who appreciated the engineering, industry professionals who needed to stay current with gaming trends, collectors who couldn't stand not owning every console. This niche audience kept the 3DO alive in its early months, but it was nowhere near enough to meet the sales targets 3DO Company had projected. In the first few months after launch, Panasonic managed to sell approximately 30,000 units in North America. This sounds respectable until you compare it to the competition. The Super Nintendo was selling millions of units per year. The Sega Genesis was selling similar numbers. Even the struggling Atari Jaguar, which launched shortly after the 3DO at a more reasonable $300 price point, sold comparably in its early months. The 3DO wasn't failing catastrophically, but it wasn't succeeding either. 3DO Company's leadership remained publicly optimistic. Trip Hawkins gave interviews insisting that adoption would accelerate once people saw the software. The price would come down as manufacturing costs decreased and as competition between manufacturers drove efficiencies. By the 1994 holiday season, they projected, prices would drop to around $500, making the system much more accessible. The strategy was to capture the premium market first, then expand downward as costs allowed, but internally concerns were growing. Software developers who had committed to the platform were watching sales numbers carefully. If the installed base remained tiny, it wouldn't be economically viable to develop exclusive titles. Publishers could make more money by focusing on systems with millions of users rather than betting on a platform that might never achieve scale. And without strong software support, the 3DO would never attract more users. The cycle was vicious. Panasonic also faced pressure. They had invested heavily in the 3DO, building manufacturing capacity and marketing campaigns around the platform. But slow sales meant inventory was accumulating. Retailers were cautious about ordering large quantities when sell-through was uncertain. And as a hardware manufacturer, Panasonic made their profit margins on volume. Selling 30,000 units might cover costs, but it wouldn't generate the returns they had hoped for. The pricing problem extended beyond just the console itself. To actually use a 3DO at launch, you needed the console at $700, at least one game at $50 to $75, and ideally a second controller at $50. You were looking at close to $900 for a basic setup. Want more games? Another $75 each. That price of entry was prohibitive not just for budget-conscious consumers, but even for middle-class families who might splurge on a regular console. Some retailers tried to soften the blow through financing options or bundle deals. Buy the console and get a free game. Layaway plans that let customers pay over several months. Trade-in programs where you could sell your old console toward the purchase of a 3DO. These helped somewhat, but they didn't fundamentally change the economics. A $700 console was still a $700 console, whether you paid all at once or over time. The international market presented additional challenges. In Europe, the 3DO faced not only price resistance, but also competition from computer gaming, which was more popular there than in North America. European gamers often preferred PCs for their versatility and upgradability. A console, even one as advanced as the 3DO, had to offer compelling advantages to justify the cost, and at launch, those advantages weren't immediately obvious to European consumers. In Japan, the pricing was similarly problematic, though the reception was more mixed. Japanese consumers had historically been more willing to pay premium prices for electronics, and the 3DO's multimedia capabilities aligned well with Japanese preferences. But even in Japan, competing systems from established companies like Nintendo and Sega were deeply entrenched. Breaking into that market required not just good hardware, but also strong software support from Japanese developers, which took time to materialize. The most painful aspect of the pricing dilemma was that everyone involved knew it was a problem, yet no one could fix it quickly. Manufacturing costs were fixed in the short term, licensing agreements were already signed, retailer margins were established. Reducing the price would mean someone had to absorb losses, and no one was willing to do that initially. Everyone hoped that volume would increase organically, allowing prices to fall naturally. But volume stayed stubbornly low because prices stayed high. Looking back, it's clear that the $700 price tag was the 3DO's original sin. Not because the hardware wasn't worth it from a technological standpoint. The engineering and capabilities justified a premium price. But markets don't operate on abstract technological merit. They operate on perception, psychology, and what people are willing and able to spend on entertainment. And in 1993, $700 for a gaming console was simply too much for the market to bear. When the Panasonic 3DO launched in October 1993, the software library was small but carefully curated to showcase the system's capabilities. Trip Hawkins and his team understood that hardware alone wouldn't sell the console. They needed games that demonstrated why someone should spend $700, games that simply couldn't exist on older systems. The launch lineup aimed to deliver exactly that, with mixed results. The flagship launch title was Crash and Burn, a futuristic racing combat game developed by Crystal Dynamics. This was meant to be the 3DO's killer app, its answer to Super Mario World or Sonic the Hedgehog. The game featured fast-paced racing combined with vehicular combat on tracks set in a dystopian future. Visually, it was impressive for 1993. The 3D graphics were smooth, the sense of speed was convincing, and the game featured full-motion video cutscenes that introduced a story and characters. Crash and Burn had ambition written all over it. The FMV sequences featured actors in costumes and sets, telling a story about underground racing in a world where corporations controlled everything. The production values were substantially higher than anything seen in console games before. For players experiencing it for the first time, especially on a large television with good speakers, the presentation was genuinely impressive. It felt like you were playing through a science fiction movie rather than just a video game. But beneath the impressive presentation, the gameplay was solid but not revolutionary. The racing felt good, the combat was satisfying, and the track design showed creativity. However, it wasn't so dramatically better than games on existing systems that it justified the 3DO's price on its own. It was a very good launch game, but not a transcendent one. And for a system asking consumers to spend $700, good might not have been enough. Another notable launch title was The Seventh Guest, which became one of the 3DO's most talked about games. Developed by Trilobyte and published by Virgin Interactive, this was a puzzle-adventure game set in a haunted mansion. You played as an invisible presence exploring the mansion, solving puzzles, and uncovering the dark story of its owner and the guests he invited to a mysterious gathering. What made The Seventh Guest special was its extensive use of full-motion video and pre-rendered 3D graphics. Every room in the mansion was rendered as a detailed 3D environment using CGI technology that was cutting edge for the time. The camera moved smoothly through these spaces, creating a sense of exploration and immersion. Characters appeared as digitized actors overlaid on the 3D backgrounds, moving through the mansion and interacting with each other in grainy but impressive video clips. The game also featured a full orchestral soundtrack and extensive voice acting, all recorded at CD quality. The Seventh Guest had actually been released earlier on CD-ROM for personal computers, where it became a massive hit and helped drive adoption of CD-ROM drives. The 3DO version was essentially a direct port, but it played beautifully on the console. This was important because it demonstrated that the 3DO could deliver the same multimedia experiences as high-end PCs, but in a living room environment without the complexity of computer setup and configuration. The game was also brutally difficult in places, with some puzzles that left players stumped for hours. But this difficulty contributed to its appeal. In an era before widespread internet walkthroughs, players would discuss puzzle solutions with friends, creating a social dimension to the single-player experience. The Seventh Guest became a showcase title that 3DO owners used to demonstrate their systems to skeptical friends. The combination of atmosphere, graphics, and audio was unlike anything most people had experienced in a game. Plumbers Don't Wear Ties also launched near the system's debut, though calling it a game is generous. This interactive movie featured live-action video of actors making choices in a romantic comedy storyline. The production values were embarrassingly low, with static images replacing actual video for most scenes, awkward acting, and a thin excuse for interactivity. It became notorious as one of the worst games ever made, a cautionary tale about confusing interactive with good. This highlighted a problem that would plague the 3DO throughout its life. the flood of low-quality full-motion video games. The CD format made FMV possible, and many developers assumed that interactive movies were the future of gaming. But most of these efforts were poorly made, with bad acting, terrible production values, and minimal actual gameplay. They gave the 3DO a reputation for prioritizing style over substance, for caring more about multimedia spectacle than actual game design. Twisted. The Game Show was another FMV title that launched early in the 3DO's life. This was a trivia game show where you answered questions while watching digitized video of a host and contestants. The questions were decent, and the production was reasonably professional, but it exemplified the problem with many early CD-ROM games. They used the technology for its own sake, rather than in service of compelling gameplay. Trivia games could work perfectly well without full-motion video. The FMV didn't enhance the experience meaningfully. On the more traditional gaming front, Stellar 7: Draxon's Revenge offered tank-based combat in 3D environments. It was a remake of a classic Apple II game, updated with texture-mapped 3D graphics. The game featured mission-based structure where you piloted a futuristic tank across various planets, fighting enemy vehicles and completing objectives. While not as flashy as the FMV showcases, Stellar 7 represented the kind of game that actually leveraged the 3DO's 3D capabilities for legitimate gameplay purposes. Total Eclipse was a space shooter that showed what the 3DO could do with fast action and 3D graphics. You flew through space environments, dogfighting with enemy ships and completing mission objectives. The game featured 6 degrees of freedom movement, allowing you to roll, pitch, and yaw freely while flying. The graphics were smooth for the time, and the sense of speed and space combat was well executed. This was the kind of game that couldn't be properly done on 16-bit systems, giving the 3DO a legitimate advantage. Out of This World, known as Another World in Europe, was a cinematic platformer originally created by Eric Chahi for the Amiga and DOS. The 3DO version featured enhanced graphics and audio, making this artistic masterpiece look and sound better than ever. The game's rotoscoped animation, minimalist storytelling, and challenging gameplay had already earned it classic status, and the 3DO port introduced it to a new audience while showcasing how enhanced hardware could improve already great games without changing their essential character. Way of the Warrior launched as a Mortal Kombat-style fighting game with digitized actors and over-the-top violence. The game featured an impressively large roster of fighters, each motion captured from real martial artists. The graphics were sharp, the animation was smooth, and the violence was gratuitous in the way that appealed to a certain audience in the early 90s. The game also featured a soundtrack by White Zombie, a popular metal band of the era which played during fights and was actually quite good. However, Way of the Warrior also demonstrated that digitized graphics alone don't make a great fighting game. The gameplay was stiff compared to Street Fighter II or Mortal Kombat 2, which had launched on other systems. Hit detection was imprecise, combos felt unnatural, and the balance between characters was questionable. It looked impressive in screenshots but played awkwardly in practice. Still, it became popular among 3DO owners hungry for any decent fighting game. John Madden Football was the 3DO version of Electronic Arts' flagship sports franchise. Given Trip Hawkins' history with EA, getting Madden on the 3DO was essentially guaranteed. The 3DO version featured enhanced graphics, more animation frames, better audio commentary from John Madden and Pat Summerall, and larger playbooks than the 16-bit versions. For sports fans, this was arguably the best reason to buy a 3DO, as it represented a genuine improvement over versions on other consoles. Sports games in general would become an area where the 3DO found some success. EA released enhanced versions of their other sports titles like FIFA International Soccer and NHL Hockey on the system. These games took advantage of the CD format for better audio commentary, larger stadiums with more detail and smoother animation. While they didn't revolutionize sports gaming, they are noticeably better than their 16-bit counterparts, giving the 3DO a legitimate selling point for sports enthusiasts. The Lost Files of Sherlock Holmes was an adventure game that showcased the 3DO's ability to handle traditional point-and-click gameplay with enhanced production values. The game featured hand-drawn graphics, full voice acting for all characters, and a complex mystery storyline. It wasn't an action game or a flashy FMV showcase, but it demonstrated that the 3DO could deliver thoughtful, story-driven experiences for players who wanted something more cerebral. Looking at the launch and early library, patterns emerge. The 3DO had 3 types of games: FMV showcases that used the CD format for video clips, enhanced ports of PC CD-ROM games that brought computer gaming to the living room, and upgraded versions of games available on other consoles. What it lacked in those early months were truly original titles that could only exist on the 3DO and couldn't be approximated elsewhere. This wasn't entirely fair to the system. Many of its games were genuinely impressive in 1993. The combination of CD-quality audio, enhanced graphics, and multimedia capabilities created experiences that felt next-generation compared to cartridge systems. But the problem remained. Were these experiences worth $700? For the hardcore early adopters, the answer was yes. For mainstream consumers, the answer remained unclear. The reviews of early 3DO games were generally positive, but with reservations. Critics praised the technical achievements and the ambition of many titles. But they also noted that gameplay often felt secondary to spectacle, that many games were too short, and that the library lacked breadth. If you liked racing games, puzzle games, and FMV experiences, the 3DO had you covered. If you preferred RPGs, platformers, or action-adventure games, the options were limited. Third-party support in the early days was reasonably strong. Publishers like Electronic Arts, Crystal Dynamics, Acclaim, and Capcom committed to the platform. They believed in Trip Hawkins' vision and wanted to be part of the next generation. But their commitment came with conditions. They would support the 3DO as long as it showed commercial promise. If sales remained low and the installed base stayed small, they would redirect their resources to more profitable platforms. This created constant pressure. Every sales report, every quarterly update, every analyst prediction was scrutinized by publishers deciding how much to invest in 3DO development. And as 1993 turned into 1994, those reports were not encouraging. The 3DO was surviving, yes, but it wasn't thriving. It wasn't meeting the ambitious targets 3DO Company had set. And as competition from Sony and Sega loomed on the horizon, the window of opportunity was closing. As 1994 began, the competitive landscape was shifting in ways that would prove devastating for the 3DO. 2 major electronics companies were preparing to enter the console market, and both had learned from watching the 3DO's struggles. Sony was preparing the PlayStation, and Sega was developing the Saturn. Both companies looked at what the 3DO had accomplished technically, and what it had failed to accomplish commercially, and they crafted strategies accordingly. Sony's entry into gaming was particularly significant because they approached it with the resources and patience of a true electronics giant. Sony had been humiliated by Nintendo a few years earlier, when a planned partnership to create a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo had fallen apart at the last moment. Nintendo had very publicly partnered with Philips instead. leaving Sony holding prototype hardware and looking foolish. That betrayal motivated Sony to prove they could succeed in gaming without Nintendo's help. The PlayStation project was led by Ken Kutaragi, an engineer within Sony, who'd been working on CD-ROM technology and believed passionately in its future for gaming. Kutaragi convinced Sony's leadership to invest heavily in developing a dedicated gaming console that would leverage Sony's expertise in CD technology, while offering performance that could compete with anything else on the market. The result was the PlayStation, a 32-bit system built around a custom CPU developed with LSI logic. What Sony learned from watching the 3DO was straightforward. Price matters more than anything else. The PlayStation specifications were impressive, comparable to the 3DO in many ways and superior in others. But Sony was willing to take losses on hardware to build an installed base quickly. They planned to make their money on software licensing, game sales, and peripherals. The console itself would be priced aggressively to capture market share. Rumors suggested a launch price around $290, less than half what the 3DO cost. Sony also invested heavily in first-party game development and secured exclusive third-party partnerships. They understood that a console was only as good as its software library. Namco, one of Japan's biggest developers, committed to bringing their arcade hits to PlayStation. Konami, Capcom, Squaresoft, and other major publishers were brought into the fold with developer-friendly tools, generous licensing terms, and promises of massive marketing support. Sony was building an ecosystem, not just selling a box. The PlayStation would also introduce innovations that went beyond raw technical specs. The controller featured 4 shoulder buttons instead of 2, giving developers more input options. The memory card system allowed players to save games and take their saves to friends' houses, enhancing the social aspect of console gaming. And Sony designed the system to be easily expandable, with plans for peripherals like the PlayStation mouse, light guns, and eventually even a small LCD screen that could be attached to make it portable. Sega, meanwhile, was in a complicated position. The Genesis was still selling well, and Sega had momentum in North America thanks to strong marketing and the popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog. But they knew they needed a next-generation system to compete with Sony and maintain their position against Nintendo's inevitable response. The result was the Saturn, a technically ambitious but complex console that would launch in Japan in late 1994 and in North America and Europe in 1995. The Saturn's architecture was unusual, featuring dual processors instead of a single CPU. This design was intended to provide massive processing power for 3D graphics, which everyone understood would be crucial for next-generation gaming. But the dual CPU design made the system difficult to program. Developers had to write code that split tasks efficiently between the processors, which required expertise and time that not everyone possessed. Games that mastered this architecture ran beautifully. Games that didn't often performed worse than they would on simpler hardware. Sega also priced the Saturn aggressively. They understood that the 3DO's pricing had limited its adoption, and they were determined not to make the same mistake. The Saturn would launch at $390, significantly more affordable than the 3DO while still allowing Sega to recoup costs over time. This put it in an interesting middle position. More expensive than the Genesis, but far cheaper than the 3DO, and potentially cheaper than the PlayStation depending on Sony's final pricing. For the 3DO, these developments were ominous. When it launched in late 1993, it had been the only next-generation console available. It had a year or more to establish itself before serious competition arrived, but that window was closing rapidly. By late 1994, both the PlayStation and Saturn would be on the market in Japan, and North American launches would follow shortly after. The 3DO would no longer be competing against 16-bit systems. It would be competing against consoles from Sony and Sega that were just as powerful, just as multimedia capable, and far less expensive. Trip Hawkins and his team were acutely aware of this threat. In interviews throughout 1994, Hawkins emphasized the 3DO's advantages: its open platform model, its multiple manufacturers driving competition and innovation, its growing library of multimedia software. He pointed out that the 3DO was already available, while competitors were still months away from launch. He argued that the 3DO would have a larger library and more mature software by the time PlayStation and Saturn arrived, giving it an edge despite the price differential. But internally, there was growing recognition that price reductions were essential. Panasonic announced in early 1994 that they would lower the price of the 3DO to $590 by spring, and aimed for $419 by the 1994 holiday season. These reductions helped somewhat, making the system more accessible to a broader audience. But even at $500, the 3DO was still substantially more expensive than upcoming competitors, and the price cut squeezed Panasonic's already thin margins, making each sale less profitable. Additional manufacturers entered the fray to spread the costs and risks. Goldstar, a Korean electronics company, released their own version of the 3DO in 1994. Their model was functionally identical to Panasonic's, but featured slightly different industrial design and sometimes sold at slightly lower prices. Sanya followed with their own 3DO model, primarily targeting the Japanese market. The idea behind the multi-manufacturer model was that competition would drive prices down naturally, but in practice all manufacturers faced similar cost structures and couldn't reduce prices significantly without losing money. The gaming press began running direct comparisons between the 3DO and upcoming competitors. Magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly and GamePro published preview articles about the PlayStation and Saturn, and these articles inevitably discussed how they stacked up against the 3DO. The conclusions were rarely favourable to the 3DO. While it had launched first and had a library of games already available, the newer systems looked more powerful, cost less, and had stronger publisher support. One area where the 3DO still held an advantage was in multimedia capabilities. The system could play audio CDs natively, which both PlayStation and Saturn would also support. But the 3DO's video CD support and its photo CD capabilities were still unique. For consumers interested in a device that could serve multiple entertainment functions, the 3DO offered value. But this positioning as a multimedia device rather than a pure gaming console was a double-edged sword. It broadened the potential market, but also made the 3DO less focused and harder to market effectively. By mid-1994, third-party publishers were hedging their bets. Companies that had initially committed strongly to the 3DO were now splitting development resources. A team that might have been working exclusively on a 3DO title now had to consider PlayStation and Saturn versions as well. This didn't mean abandoning the 3DO entirely, but it meant the system was no longer receiving undivided attention from developers. Exclusive titles became rarer as publishers sought to maximize returns by releasing games on multiple platforms. The PlayStation's December 1994 launch in Japan was a massive success. Sony moved over 300,000 units in the first month, completely surpassing the 3DO's entire installed base in Japan. The games were impressive, the price was right, and Sony's marketing machine was firing on all cylinders. Japanese consumers, who might have been the 3DO's strongest market given their affinity for multimedia electronics, were instead flocking to the PlayStation. The Saturn's launch in Japan also went well, though not quite as explosively as the PlayStation. Sega had a loyal following, and the Saturn's arcade-perfect ports of games like Virtua Fighter gave it a strong identity as the system for serious gamers who wanted the arcade experience at home. The Saturn's higher price point compared to PlayStation made it less accessible, but it was still far cheaper than the 3DO, and its software lineup was strong from day one. For the 3DO, the implications were clear. The system that had been positioned as the future of multimedia gaming was suddenly looking like an expensive intermediate step rather than a revolution. The open platform model that was supposed to drive innovation hadn't produced significant cost reductions or dramatic hardware improvements. The licensing model that was supposed to create a virtuous cycle of software support was instead creating friction as publishers compared the costs of developing for 3DO versus other platforms. Trip Hawkins remained publicly confident, but the pressure was mounting. The 3DO company's stock price, which had soared after the initial launch, was trending downward. Investors were nervous about competition from Sony and Sega. Retailers were cautious about stocking a premium-priced console when cheaper alternatives were arriving, and consumers were doing what consumers always do when new technology is imminent: waiting. Why buy a $500 3DO today when you could wait a few months and buy a PlayStation for $296 or a Saturn for $315? The marketing message became increasingly complicated. The 3DO tried to differentiate itself by emphasizing its multimedia capabilities, its mature software library, and its status as an open platform. But these arguments required explanation and education. The PlayStation and Saturn could be sold simply. They were powerful gaming consoles at affordable prices with impressive games. The 3DO's value proposition, while real, was more nuanced and harder to communicate in a 30-second commercial or a print advertisement. As 1994 progressed and the holiday season approached, the North American launches of PlayStation and Saturn loomed. Sega would make the controversial decision to surprise launch the Saturn in May 1995, several months ahead of the planned September date, hoping to steal mindshare and shelf space before the PlayStation arrived. Sony would launch the PlayStation in North America in September 1995 at the famous E3 press conference, where they announced the $299 price point to thunderous applause, immediately undercutting both Sega and the 3DO. The 3DO's moment had passed. It had enjoyed roughly a year as the only next-generation option, but that window had closed. The system that had launched at $700, dropped to $500, and would eventually fall below $300 by 1996, was now competing not on innovation or capabilities, but on price against systems that were newer, better supported, and backed by companies with far deeper pockets. The battle ahead would be brutal, and the 3DO was entering it from a position of weakness. Despite the challenges posed by price and emerging competition, the 3DO company and its manufacturing partners invested heavily in marketing throughout 1994 and into 1995. They understood that awareness was crucial, and that the system's unique value proposition needed to be communicated effectively to cut through the noise of an increasingly crowded marketplace. The marketing campaigns they created were ambitious, expensive, and ultimately unable to overcome the fundamental challenges the platform faced. Panasonic, as the primary manufacturer and the company with the most invested in the 3DO's success, led the marketing charge. Their campaigns emphasized the 3DO as a premium entertainment device rather than a toy. Television commercials featured sleek visuals, pulsing electronic music, and taglines that positioned the 3DO as the future of home entertainment. They showcased the system in modern living rooms, not children's bedrooms, reinforcing the adult-oriented positioning that the high price demanded. One memorable commercial featured a series of quick cuts showing the 3DO playing different types of content: a racing game, a video CD movie, a music CD, an interactive experience. The voiceover intoned, "This is not just a game system. This is the 3DO interactive multiplayer. This is the future." The production values were high, and the message was clear. The 3DO was something new and different, worth paying extra for if you wanted to be at the cutting edge of technology. Print advertising in gaming magazines and general interest publications followed similar themes. Full-page spreads showcased the system's capabilities with impressive screenshots and detailed specifications. The ads often included pull quotes from positive reviews, emphasizing phrases like next-generation gaming and multimedia powerhouse. They listed the growing library of titles and highlighted exclusive games or enhanced versions of popular PC titles that were coming to the platform. Retail partnerships were crucial to the 3DO's strategy. 3DO Company worked with major retailers like Toys R Us, Electronics Boutique, Babbage's, and larger department stores to create in-store displays and demo stations. These kiosks featured playable 3DO units, running attractive games, usually crash and burn, the need for speed, or return fire. The idea was that once people saw the system in action and experienced the graphics and audio firsthand, the price would seem more justifiable. These demo stations were generally well received. Gamers who stopped to play were often impressed by what they saw. The graphics were noticeably sharper than Genesis or Super Nintendo. The CD audio was rich and immersive. The games felt next generation in ways that were immediately apparent. Store employees reported that the 3DO demos generated significant interest and resulted in sales among customers who could afford the price. But converting interest into purchases was the ongoing challenge. Goldstar's entry as a second manufacturer was supposed to help expand the market. Their 3DO units were priced slightly lower than Panasonic's, sometimes by as much as $50. The idea was that price-conscious consumers who were interested in the 3DO but unwilling to pay Panasonic's price might opt for the Goldstar version instead. In practice, the difference was rarely large enough to matter, and Goldstar's marketing budget was much smaller than Panasonic's, limiting their impact. Sanyo's 3DO units, primarily sold in Japan and Asian markets, targeted consumers who wanted a high-end multimedia device with gaming capabilities. Sanyo emphasized the video CD playback features, which were more relevant in Asia, where video CD had gained traction as a movie format. Their marketing positioned the 3DO as a premium electronics component that happened to play excellent games, appealing to the Japanese market's appreciation for multifunctional devices. The multi-manufacturer model, which was supposed to be the 3DO's secret weapon, never quite delivered on its promise. The theory was sound. Multiple companies competing to produce the best version of the hardware would drive innovation, improve quality, and reduce prices through competition. But in practice, all manufacturers face similar cost structures. The licensing fees to 3DO Company were fixed. Component costs were roughly the same for everyone. Manufacturing processes were similar. There wasn't enough differentiation between the various models to create meaningful competition. Furthermore, the multi-manufacturer approach created confusion for consumers. When someone decided they wanted a 3DO, they then had to choose which manufacturer's version to buy. Were they different? Was one better than the others? Stores often stocked only one manufacturer's units, limiting choice. The model that was supposed to be an advantage sometimes felt like a liability, adding an extra layer of complexity to an already difficult purchase decision. Partnership announcements were a regular feature of 3DO's marketing strategy. Throughout 1994, 3DO Company issued press releases announcing new publishers joining the platform, new games in development, and new territories where the system would be available. Each announcement was framed as evidence of growing momentum and industry support. The message was always optimistic. The 3DO family was expanding, the ecosystem was thriving, and the future looked bright. Some partnerships were genuinely significant. When Crystal Dynamics committed to developing exclusive titles for the 3DO, it validated the platform's appeal to developers. When companies like Acclaim, Time Warner Interactive, and Activision announced 3DO games, it demonstrated that major publishers saw commercial potential. When American Laser Games brought their light gun arcade games to 3DO, it added another genre to the library and showcased the system's versatility. Educational and reference software became another marketing angle. The 3DO's multimedia capabilities made it suitable for interactive encyclopedias, language learning programs, and other educational content. Companies like the Discovery Channel and National Geographic released 3DO titles that combined education with entertainment. Marketing materials began promoting the 3DO as a device for the whole family, not just gamers, expanding the potential audience beyond young males into households with children of various ages. The concept of 3DO interactive sampler discs was introduced as a marketing tool. These discs contained playable demos of multiple games, video trailers, and interactive content showcasing the system's capabilities. They were distributed through magazines included with new 3DO units and sometimes given away at retail locations. The samplers let potential customers experience the system's library without committing to full-priced purchases, and they helped demonstrate the breadth of content available. Magazine partnerships extended the marketing reach. Gaming publications ran special 3DO sections, sometimes entire issues dedicated to the platform. These features included developer interviews, behind-the-scenes looks at game development, technical deep dives into the hardware, and previews of upcoming titles. While this coverage was sometimes paid for through advertising or promotional agreements, it provided valuable exposure and helped maintain enthusiasm among existing 3DO owners who needed reassurance that the platform had a future. Events and promotions created buzz around the system. The 3DO Company sponsored gaming tournaments, set up booths at electronic shows and gaming conventions, and organized launch parties for major releases. These events generated press coverage and created opportunities for hands-on experiences with the hardware. At E3, the annual gaming industry trade show 3DO consistently maintained a significant presence, showcasing upcoming games and hardware revisions. Licensing deals with entertainment properties attempted to attract broader audiences. Sports licenses were particularly important. Having official NFL, NBA, and NHL games lent credibility and appealed to sports fans who might not consider themselves gamers. FIFA International Soccer brought soccer to the platform, crucial for European and Latin American markets. These licensed titles also benefited from the marketing power of the sports leagues themselves, with cross-promotional opportunities and co-branding. The international expansion strategy varied by region. In Europe, the 3DO faced strong competition from computer gaming, so marketing emphasized the system as a way to get PC-quality games without the complexity and cost of a gaming PC. In Asian markets, the multimedia capabilities and karaoke functions, some Asian 3DO models included karaoke features, were highlighted. The message was tailored to local preferences and competitive landscapes, recognizing that one-size-fits-all marketing wouldn't work globally. Price drop announcements were carefully choreographed to maximize their marketing impact. When Panasonic reduced the price from $700 to $599, then to $499 and eventually below $400. Each reduction was accompanied by press releases, advertisements, and promotional campaigns. The message was always aspirational. The amazing 3DO was now more affordable, bringing next-generation entertainment within reach of more consumers. These price drops did temporarily boost sales, showing that demand existed if the price was right. Bundle deals became increasingly common as the 3DO struggled to gain traction. Retailers and manufacturers offered packages that included the console, one or more games, and sometimes an extra controller or other accessories at a bundled price that offered savings versus buying everything separately. These bundles made the value proposition clearer and reduced the sticker shock somewhat. A $449 bundle with 2 games and a second controller felt more reasonable than a $449 bare console that still required game purchases. Celebrity endorsements and testimonials appeared in marketing materials. Trip Hawkins himself was a frequently featured personality, giving interviews and appearing in promotional content. His background as the founder of Electronic Arts lent credibility, and his enthusiasm for the 3DO's vision was genuine and often contagious. Other technology executives, game developers, and occasionally entertainment figures would be quoted praising the system, adding social proof to the marketing messages. Despite all these efforts, the marketing could never quite overcome the fundamental challenges. The messaging was sometimes confused, trying to position the 3DO as both a gaming console and a multimedia device, appealing to gamers and families, serving as a premium product and an accessible entertainment option. The campaigns were expensive, particularly for Panasonic, which invested hundreds of millions of dollars into the 3DO over its lifespan. But in the end, marketing can only do so much. If the product's price is wrong for the market and competitors offer better value, no amount of advertising can fix the problem. Looking at the 3DO from a purely technical perspective reveals a fascinating mix of forward-thinking design choices and critical oversights. The system was genuinely advanced for 1993, incorporating ideas that wouldn't become standard in consoles for years, but it also made decisions that limited its long-term viability and left it vulnerable to competitors who learned from its example. Understanding these technical details helps explain both why the 3DO inspired such initial enthusiasm and why it ultimately couldn't sustain that momentum. The decision to use CD-ROM as the primary storage medium was absolutely correct. By 1993, it was becoming clear that optical media would replace cartridges for most applications. CDs offered storage capacity measured in hundreds of megabytes versus the few megabytes available on even the largest cartridges. They were cheap to manufacture, costing less than $1 per disc versus $5 to $15 for a cartridge. They allowed for full motion video, CD quality audio, and enormous game worlds that would be impossible on ROM-based media. The 3DO's double-speed CD drive was faster than the standard single-speed drives common in 1993, reducing loading times and enabling real-time streaming of data. This was crucial for maintaining the illusion of interactivity in FMV games and for allowing large 3D environments to load seamlessly without constant loading screens. While still slower than cartridge access times, the CD drive's performance was generally good enough that most games didn't suffer from excessive loading, at least not by the standards of the era. However, the reliance on CD-ROM also introduced limitations. CD drives were mechanical devices with moving parts that could fail, were relatively slow compared to ROM cartridges, and required developers to carefully optimize data layout on disks to minimize seek times. Games needed to be structured around the CD's limitations, preloading data into RAM when possible, and organizing assets to minimize the drive's need to seek between distant parts of the disk. This was manageable, but added complexity to development. The ARM60 processor choice was inspired. ARM processors were power-efficient, cost-effective, and performed well for their clock speed. The RISC architecture meant simpler instructions that could execute quickly, and the 32-bit data paths allowed for operations on larger chunks of data than 16-bit processors. This processor would prove to be a glimpse of the future. ARM would eventually become the dominant architecture in mobile devices and modern gaming consoles, though that wasn't obvious in 1993. But the ARM60 running at just 12.5 MHz wasn't as powerful as it needed to be for the 3DO's ambitions, particularly for 3D graphics. Later 32-bit consoles would feature processors running at significantly higher clock speeds. The PlayStation CPU, for instance, ran at 33.8 MHz, nearly 3 times faster. While the ARM architecture was efficient, it couldn't overcome the clock speed disadvantage entirely. For complex 3D calculations, the 3DO often struggled where later systems excelled. The custom graphics chips, the CEL engine, and associated hardware were well designed for 2D graphics and video playback. They could push impressive sprite-based graphics, handle transparency and scaling effects smoothly, and decompress and display full-motion video reasonably well. For the kinds of games that were popular in the early 90s, side-scrollers, shoot-'em-ups, fighting games with digitized graphics, the 3DO's graphics hardware was more than adequate and often superior to competing systems. For 3D graphics, though, the 3DO was less impressive. The system lacked dedicated 3D hardware acceleration, relying instead on software rendering running on the main CPU and graphics processors. This approach was flexible but slow. Early 3D games on the 3DO featured low polygon counts, simple textures, and sometimes choppy frame rates. While impressive for 1993, they would be quickly surpassed by dedicated 3D hardware in later consoles. The PlayStation, by contrast, included a dedicated geometry transformation engine and a GPU specifically designed for 3D rendering. These chips could perform the complex calculations needed for 3D graphics much faster than general-purpose processors. This hardware advantage meant PlayStation games could feature more polygons, more complex lighting, better texture mapping, and smoother frame rates in 3D titles. The Saturn, despite its complex dual CPU architecture, also included dedicated 3D hardware that outperformed the 3DO's software-based approach. The audio system in the 3DO was one of its genuine strengths throughout its lifespan. The dedicated DSP for audio meant that games could feature rich soundscapes without impacting other performance. CD-quality music became standard, and many 3DO games featured orchestral soundtracks, extensive voice acting, and complex audio effects. For players with good sound systems, the audio experience on 3DO was genuinely superior to what 16-bit cartridge systems could deliver. The memory configuration was reasonable for the time but would prove limiting as games became more complex. 2 MB of main RAM was decent in 1993, but by 1995 and 1996, developers were craving more memory for larger game worlds, more detailed textures, and more sophisticated AI routines. The PlayStation launched with the same amount of main RAM, but its architecture was better optimized for 3D rendering, allowing it to do more with the same memory capacity. The Saturn actually included more RAM when you counted its various memory pools, giving it an advantage in certain types of games. The expansion port, which seemed like such a forward-thinking feature, never realized its potential. Few expansion devices were ever released, and those that did appear, like the MPEG card for video CD playback, served niche functions rather than fundamentally expanding the system's capabilities. The vision of a modular, upgradable console that could evolve over time never materialized because the market wasn't large enough to justify the development costs of expansion hardware. The daisy chain controller setup was clever in theory, but problematic in practice. Having controllers plug into each other eliminated the need for multi-tap accessories and allowed for up to 8 players without additional hardware. But the daisy chain meant that if any controller in the chain was disconnected, all controllers further down the line would stop functioning. This could be frustrating during multiplayer sessions. Additionally, the long chain of controllers and cables could create a tangled mess around the living room during 8-player games. The controller itself was comfortable and functional, but not particularly innovative. It featured the standard D-pad, face buttons and shoulder buttons that had become common by the mid-90s. It didn't introduce new input paradigms the way later controllers would with analog sticks, dual analog sticks, or motion controls. This was fine for the games of 1993 and 1994, but as 3D gaming evolved, the lack of analog control became a noticeable limitation. The Opera operating system was genuinely ahead of its time. Having a real OS with multitasking, a file system, and standardized APIs was unusual for consoles in 1993. Most competing systems had simple boot code that immediately handed control to the game cartridge, with minimal system services available. Opera allowed for more sophisticated interactions between games and system functions, enabled background tasks like audio playback while browsing menus, and provided consistency across different games and applications. However, the operating system also added overhead. System resources were consumed by the OS itself, leaving less memory and processing power available for games. This was an acceptable trade-off for the flexibility Opera provided, but it meant that 3DO games sometimes had less memory available for game assets than comparable games on systems with simpler firmware. As games pushed the limits of the hardware, this overhead became more noticeable. The security model for preventing piracy was weak by modern standards, though this was true for most CD-based systems of the era. CDs could be copied relatively easily compared to ROM cartridges, which required specialized equipment to duplicate. The 3DO attempted to use various copy protection schemes, but determined pirates could defeat them. Piracy wasn't as widespread for the 3DO as it would become for later systems, partly because the 3DO's small installed base made it a less attractive target for pirates. Still, the vulnerability was there and would have become a bigger problem if the system had achieved mainstream success. The build quality of the various 3DO units varied by manufacturer. Panasonic's units were generally well built, with solid construction and reliable components. Goldstar units were somewhat less expensive feeling but still functional. The CD drives, being mechanical components, were the most likely parts to fail over time, and some users reported drive issues after extended use. This was common for CD-based systems of the era and not specific to the 3DO, but it was a concern that cartridge-based systems didn't face. Power consumption and heat generation were notable. The 3DO, with its multiple processors and CD drive, drew more power than simpler cartridge systems and generated more heat. The console included fans and heat sinks to manage thermal issues, but the system could get quite warm during extended play sessions. This wasn't usually a problem for reliability, but it was something users noticed, particularly if they placed the console in enclosed entertainment centers with poor ventilation. The video output quality was generally good for the era. The 3DO supported composite and S-video outputs, with some later models offering RGB output in regions where that was standard. The image quality was sharp and colours were vibrant, particularly when using S-video or better connections. However, the 3DO didn't support progressive scan or other advanced video features that would become common in later generations. For the televisions of the mid-90s, though, the video quality was more than adequate. One often overlooked technical achievement was the 3DO's ability to play standard audio CDs directly, without needing to boot into any special mode. You could simply insert a music CD, and the system would recognize it and begin playback, often with visualizations displayed on screen. This made the 3DO a legitimate component in a home stereo system, not just a gaming device. The audio quality was excellent, matching dedicated CD players of the time, and the convenience of having one device serve multiple purposes had genuine value for consumers with limited space or budgets. The system's ability to display photo CDs, a format Kodak was promoting in the early 90s, added another multimedia dimension. Photo CD allowed film photographs to be digitized at high resolution and stored on CDs for viewing on compatible devices. While the format never achieved widespread consumer adoption, having photo CD support positioned the 3DO as a more versatile device. Families could use it to view vacation photos on their television, adding utility beyond gaming. The video CD support, particularly with the MPEG expansion card, turned the 3DO into a capable movie playback device. Video CD quality wasn't as good as Laserdisc and certainly not as good as the DVD format that would emerge later, but it was acceptable for the time and significantly cheaper than Laserdisc. In markets where video CD was popular, this feature added real value and helped justify the 3DO's premium price by consolidating multiple devices into one unit. From an engineering standpoint, the 3DO represented solid mid-90s design principles, use of standard components where possible to reduce costs, custom silicon where performance was needed, modular architecture to allow expansion, and software-based flexibility to enable future improvements through operating system updates. The system wasn't poorly designed. In many ways, it was well ahead of its time. The problems weren't primarily technical, they were economic and strategic. The hardware was too expensive to manufacture at a consumer-friendly price, and the architectural decisions didn't provide enough performance advantage over competitors to justify the cost premium. If the 3DO had launched a year earlier with no competition in sight, or if it had been priced at $400 instead of $700, or if competitors had stumbled in their execution, the technical merits of the system might have been enough to establish it as a successful platform. But technology alone isn't sufficient. The market also demands the right price, the right timing, and the right competitive positioning. The 3DO's technical achievements, while real and impressive, couldn't overcome these market realities. The 3DOS game library is a fascinating mix of ambitious experiments, impressive technical showcases, forgettable shovelware, and genuine hidden gems that deserve more recognition than they received. Over the system's commercial lifespan, approximately 250 games were released across all regions, a respectable number that compared favourably to some competing systems, but was dwarfed by the libraries available on the Super Nintendo, Genesis, and eventually the PlayStation. Let's explore some of the most notable titles that defined the 3DO experience. The Need for Speed, released in late 1994, was arguably the 3DO's most important game. Developed by Pioneer Productions and published by Electronic Arts, this racing game set a new standard for realism in driving games. It featured licensed exotic sports cars like the Dodge Viper, Mazda RX-7 and Ferrari models, rendered with impressive detail for the time. The graphics were smooth, the sense of speed was exhilarating, and the handling model struck a good balance between arcade accessibility and simulation realism. What made the Need for Speed special was its production values. The game included video clips of real automotive journalists discussing each car's characteristics, history, and performance. The FMV sequences were well produced, genuinely informative, and added context that made the game feel more like an interactive automotive magazine than just a racing game. The soundtrack featured electronic music that perfectly complemented the high-speed action, and the overall presentation was polished and professional. The 3DO version of Need for Speed was the original and best version available for nearly a year before ports appeared on other systems. This exclusivity gave the 3DO a genuine killer app that could sell systems on its own. Racing fans and car enthusiasts had a compelling reason to buy a 3DO, and many did. The game demonstrated what CD-ROM technology could bring to gaming. Large environments with varied tracks, detailed vehicles, high-quality audio, and multimedia content that enhanced the core gameplay. Return Fire was another standout title that showcased what the 3DO could do. This was an action strategy game where players controlled various military vehicles on a mission to capture the enemy's flag. You could switch between a jeep, a tank, a helicopter, and an armoured support vehicle, each with different capabilities. The isometric 3D graphics were colourful and clear, the gameplay was addictive, and the classical music soundtrack was an inspired choice that gave the game a unique personality. Return Fire was particularly impressive in multiplayer mode. The split-screen two-player battles were intense and strategic, with players needing to balance offense and defense while managing different vehicle types. The game had depth that rewarded repeated play and skill development. It became a favourite at gaming gatherings and demonstrated that the 3DO could deliver compelling multiplayer experiences despite the controller daisy-chain setup. Myst, the groundbreaking puzzle-adventure game from Cyan, found a natural home on the 3DO. The game had become a phenomenon on PC CD-ROM, using pre-rendered 3D graphics to create a mysterious island full of puzzles and secrets. The 3DO version was essentially a perfect port, taking advantage of the console's CD-ROM drive and graphics capabilities to deliver the full Myst experience on a television screen. For gamers without high-end PCs, the 3DO version was the most accessible way to experience this cultural touchstone. Star Control 2 was a space exploration and combat game that offered enormous depth and replayability. The game featured a massive galaxy to explore, dozens of alien species to interact with, ship-to-ship combat, resource gathering, and an overarching storyline that drove the exploration forward. The 3DO version added full voice acting for all alien dialogues, bringing the quirky alien characters to life in ways the PC version couldn't match. This enhanced version became the definitive way to experience Star Control 2 and remained one of the system's most beloved titles. Super Street Fighter II Turbo brought Capcom's legendary fighting game to the 3DO, with arcade-perfect graphics and sound. The game featured the full roster of characters, all the stages, and gameplay that faithfully recreated the arcade experience. The CD format allowed for high-quality voice samples and music tracks directly from the arcade version. For fighting game fans, this was one of the best home versions of Street Fighter II available anywhere in 1994. Better than the cartridge versions on other consoles due to the superior audio and graphical fidelity. Alone in the Dark arrived on the 3DO as an enhanced version of the pioneering survival horror game that had debuted on PC. The game featured polygonal 3D graphics, fixed camera angles, and tense exploration of a haunted mansion filled with monsters and puzzles. The 3DO version included improved textures, better lighting effects, and enhanced audio that made the atmosphere even more oppressive and frightening. This port helped establish the template for what survival horror could be and would influence future games in the genre. Road Rash was a motorcycle racing game with a twist. You could attack other riders with various weapons while racing. The 3DO version featured full motion video sequences between races showing your character's interactions with other racers and the progression of the story. The gameplay was fast and violent, the graphics were sharp, and the licensed soundtrack featured alternative rock bands popular in the mid-90s. It became one of the system's more popular titles, and it showed that arcade-style action could work well on the platform. Wing Commander 3: Heart of the Tiger was one of the most ambitious games ever attempted at the time. This space combat simulator featured hours of full-motion video with Hollywood actors including Mark Hamill, Malcolm McDowell and John Rhys-Davies. The FMV sequences told a complex story of interstellar war, with branching storylines based on your performance in missions. The space combat itself was engaging and challenging, with varied mission objectives and a sense of progression as you advance through the campaign. Wing Commander 3 on 3DO was spread across 4 CDs and represented a massive production budget. The video quality was surprisingly good for 1994, and seeing real actors performing a science fiction story in what was ostensibly a video game felt revolutionary at the time. While the gameplay had some rough edges and the FMV sequences could be lengthy, the overall package was unlike anything most gamers had experienced. It justified the CD-ROM format in ways that simpler games couldn't. Samurai Showdown brought SNK's weapon-based fighting game to the 3DO with impressive results. The game featured large, detailed sprites, smooth animation, and arcade-accurate gameplay. The characters were varied and interesting, each with unique weapons and fighting styles. The 3DO version included CD-quality music and voice samples that enhanced the feudal Japanese atmosphere. For fans of fighting games who wanted something different from Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, Samurai Showdown delivered. Gex was a platformer that became one of the 3DO's few original mascot characters. You played as a wisecracking gecko navigating through television-themed worlds filled with pop culture references and humour. The graphics were colourful and detailed, the levels were creative, and the gameplay was solid platforming action. Gex benefited from the CD format with extensive voice samples, including constant quips and one-liners from the main character. While not revolutionary, it was a quality platformer at a time when the 3DO library needed more variety. Killing Time was a first-person shooter set in a mansion on a mysterious island. The game combined FPS action with horror elements and puzzle solving. It featured full-motion video cutscenes, atmospheric environments, and a storyline that unfolded as you explored. The graphics were impressive for the 3DO, with detailed textures and smooth movement. While not as influential as Doom or Wolfenstein 3D, Killing Time offered a compelling single-player FPS experience on a console before that genre had fully established itself outside of PC gaming. Lucien's Quest was a Japanese RPG developed by Taito, one of the few traditional JRPGs available on the system. The game featured anime-style graphics, turn-based combat, a fantasy storyline, and CD audio for music and voice acting. For RPG fans starving for content on the 3DO, Lucien's Quest provided a solid if unspectacular adventure. It couldn't compete with the RPG libraries on other systems, but it demonstrated that the 3DO could handle the genre and that there was audience interest if developers chose to support it. Immersionary was a first-person shooter with an unusual cyberpunk setting. You navigated through virtual reality environments representing a computer system, fighting viruses and corrupt programs while unraveling a mystery. The graphics featured vibrant colours and abstract designs that gave the game a unique look. The movement was smooth, and the level design was complex and maze-like. While not a massive hit, Immersionary showed creative developers could use the 3D's capabilities to realise distinctive visions. The Horde was a tower defense game before that genre had a name. Developed by Crystal Dynamics, it mixed action, strategy, and humour as you protected your land from invading monsters. The game featured comedy sequences with full-motion video starring Kirk Cameron as the player character. While the FMV was cheesy, the core gameplay was engaging and challenging. The Horde demonstrated that the 3DO could handle real-time strategy concepts, and that mixing genres could produce interesting results. On the opposite end of the quality spectrum were games that damaged the 3DO's reputation. We've already mentioned Plumbers Don't Wear Ties, but it wasn't alone. Psychic Detective was another FMV game that prioritised video sequences over gameplay, resulting in an experience that felt more like a choose-your-own-adventure book than a game. Quarantine was a combat-driving game with an interesting premise, but frustrating execution, clunky controls, and repetitive missions that wore out their welcome quickly. Night Trap arrived on the 3DO after causing controversy on the Sega CD. This FMV game had you monitoring security cameras in a house where teenagers were being stalked by vampires. The gameplay was simplistic, the video quality was poor even by 1994 standards, and the concept felt exploitative. While it generated publicity due to its controversial subject matter, it was not a good game and didn't represent the kind of experience the 3DO should have been promoting. The library's biggest weakness was its lack of breadth in certain genres. RPGs were severely underrepresented, with only a handful of titles available over the system's entire lifespan. Platformers, which dominated on Nintendo systems, were relatively scarce. Sports games were well represented thanks to Electronic Arts, but other publishers didn't support the platformers strongly in this genre. The library had depth in racing, fighting, and FMV games, but if those genres didn't appeal to you, options were limited. Quality control was also inconsistent. While the 3DO had its share of excellent games, it also had more than its share of mediocre and poor titles. Publishers sometimes used the 3DO as a dumping ground for experimental projects or quick ports that didn't receive proper optimization. Some games were clearly designed for PC mouse and keyboard controls, and adapted poorly to console controllers. Others were tech demos masquerading as complete games, showcasing an idea but not developing it into a satisfying experience. The best 3DO games, though, were genuinely excellent and hold up reasonably well even decades later. Need for Speed established a franchise that continues today. Return Fire remains a cult classic with devoted fans. Star Control 2 is considered one of the greatest space exploration games ever made. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo delivered arcade perfection at home. These titles proved that with proper development and resources, the 3DO could host games that competed with anything on other platforms. The library's legacy is mixed. For every Wing Commander the Thee or Myst, there were several forgettable titles that faded into obscurity. The ratio of great games to mediocre ones wasn't as favourable as on more successful platforms, where the larger install bases attracted more development resources and more quality control. But for the dedicated 3DO owners who knew where to look, there was a library of games worth playing. Experiences that took advantage of the hardware's strengths and delivered entertainment that justified the platform's existence, even if it couldn't justify its price. By late 1995, the writing was on the wall with the 3DO. The PlayStation had launched in North America in September, to massive consumer enthusiasm and critical acclaim. Sony's $290 price point had been met with thunderous applause at the E3 announcement, and the games backing up the hardware were impressive. Titles like Battle Arena Toshinden, Ridge Racer and Wipeout showcased 3D graphics that exceeded what the 3DO could produce. The Sega Saturn, despite its higher $389 price and surprise early launch that angered retailers, was also gaining traction with strong arcade ports and Sega's established brand recognition. The 3DO, now priced at around $400 after multiple price cuts, was caught in an impossible position. It cost more than the PlayStation while offering inferior 3D graphics performance. It cost the same as the Saturn, but lacked Sega's first-party franchises and arcade conversions. The technical advantages it had held in 1993 and early 1994 had evaporated. The multimedia positioning that once seemed like a strength now felt like a distraction from core gaming. The open platform model hadn't produced the price competition and innovation that had been promised. Sales numbers told the story clearly. In North America, the 3DO sold approximately 100,000 units in its first year. By contrast, the PlayStation sold over 1 million units in its first 4 months on the market. The Saturn, despite its troubled launch, moved similar numbers. The gap wasn't just significant, it was insurmountable. Even aggressive price cuts couldn't close the differential when consumers perceive the competing products as superior values. Third-party publishers began quietly backing away from the platform. Companies that had committed to multiple 3DO titles started cancelling projects or redirecting them to PlayStation and Saturn. The economics were straightforward. With an installed base of just a few 100,000 units, even a successful 3DO game might sell 20 or 30,000 copies. On PlayStation, a successful game could sell hundreds of thousands, or even millions. The market was speaking, and it was saying that the 3DO's time had passed. Electronic Arts, whose founder had created the 3DO company, reduced their support gradually but decisively. While EA continued releasing sports titles on the 3DO through 1996, they were increasingly focused on PlayStation and Saturn, where the audience was larger and growing. Other publishers followed suit. By mid-1996, most major publishers had stopped announcing new 3DO projects. The few games still in development were mostly ports or minor releases that required minimal investment. Retailers began clearing out 3DO inventory with aggressive discounts. By late 1996, you could find 3DO consoles at prices below $200, sometimes bundled with several games. While these deals attracted some budget-conscious consumers and collectors, they also signaled that the platform was in its death throes. New consoles aren't supposed to be heavily discounted within a few years of launch. That only happens when a product has failed and everyone is trying to minimize losses. Panasonic, the manufacturer with the most invested in the 3DO, announced in early 1996 that they were scaling back production and marketing. They would continue manufacturing units to fulfill existing commitments, but they were not developing new models or investing further in the platform. For Panasonic, the 3DO had been an expensive lesson in the risks of consumer electronics. They had believed in Trip Hawkins' vision, invested hundreds of millions of dollars, and received minimal returns. The financial losses were substantial, though Panasonic could absorb them given their size and diversification. Goldstar and Sanyo made similar decisions around the same time. Without Panasonic's commitment, the multi-manufacturer model collapsed. The promised competition between manufacturers to drive innovation and reduce prices never materialized, because all manufacturers realized simultaneously that continuing to invest in the 3DO made no business sense. The platform was dead in all but name, though it would take several more months for everyone to officially acknowledge this reality. The 3DO company itself pivoted away from hardware. In late 1996, Trip Hawkins announced that the company would become a software publisher rather than a hardware platform. They'd focus on developing games for successful platforms like PlayStation, Saturn, and eventually Nintendo 64. The message was clear. The dream of an open, multi-manufacturer gaming platform had failed, and the company would salvage what it could by transitioning to a different business model. This pivot was pragmatic, but also somewhat sad. The 3DO company had been founded with a revolutionary vision of how gaming platforms should work. Trip Hawkins genuinely believed that the console industry's closed, proprietary model was wrong, and that an open platform would benefit everyone. The failure of that vision meant more than just lost money. It meant the industry would continue with the traditional model for years to come, with console manufacturers controlling their platforms tightly and extracting value from publishers and consumers. The M2, which was supposed to be the 3DO's successor, was cancelled. This next-generation system had been in development since 1994, featuring significantly more powerful hardware that could finally deliver the 3D graphics performance the original 3DO had promised but couldn't quite achieve. Matsushita had intended to manufacture the M2, and prototypes demonstrated impressive capabilities. But with the 3DO platform dead and competitors like Sony establishing dominance, there was no appetite to repeat the expensive failure. The M2 technology wasn't entirely wasted. The graphics chips and some architectural ideas were eventually used in arcade machines and specialized equipment, but the gaming console that might have redeemed the 3DO's reputation never saw commercial release. For fans who had supported the 3DO and hoped for a revival, the M2's cancellation was the final disappointment, the moment when hope turned to resignation. Game releases trickled through 1996 and early 1997, but the quality and frequency declined. Most late releases were either ports of older games or low-budget titles from small publishers trying to eke out sales from the remaining installed base. A few developers, like Crystal Dynamics, continued supporting the platform out of loyalty or contractual obligation, but even they eventually moved on. The last officially licensed 3DO game was Samurai Showdown in December 1997, though a few unlicensed or region-exclusive titles appeared later. For 3DO owners, the platform's decline was frustrating. Many had paid premium prices believing they were buying into the future of gaming. They'd been told the 3DO was revolutionary, that its open platform model would ensure long-term support, that it was the system to own for next-generation gaming. Instead, they watched as support evaporated, game releases slowed to a trickle, and the systems they had paid hundreds of dollars for became obsolete curiosities. The secondary market for 3DO games and hardware collapsed. Used 3DO consoles that had sold for $700 new in 1993 were worth perhaps $50 by 1997's. Games that had retailed for $60 were showing up in discount bins for a few dollars. Collectors weren't yet interested in preserving 3DO libraries because the system's failure was too recent and too painful. It would take years before retro gaming enthusiasts would revisit the 3DO and recognize its historical importance. Some owners held on to their 3DOs as CD players or video CD players, squeezing utility from the hardware even after gaming support ended. The system could still play audio CDs perfectly well, and for those with video CD collections, it remained functional. But as DVD became the dominant video format in the late 90s, even this utility diminished. By the early 2000s, most 3DO consoles had been relegated to closets, attics, or landfills. The few dedicated fans who remained formed small online communities to discuss the system, share memories, and preserve games. These early enthusiasts kept the 3DO's memory alive when the industry had largely forgotten it. They created websites, archived game reviews, shared technical documentation, and argued about which games best represented what the platform could have been. Their passion suggested that despite its commercial failure, the 3DO had meant something to those who experienced it at its peak. Despite its commercial failure, the 3DO left a significant legacy that influenced console design, business models, and industry thinking for years afterward. The lessons learned from the 3DO's struggles shaped decisions made by Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, and others as they developed subsequent generations of gaming hardware. Understanding this legacy helps contextualize the 3DO's importance beyond its sales numbers and brief commercial lifespan. The most obvious lesson was about pricing. No console launched at $700 could succeed in the mainstream market, regardless of its technical merits or unique features. This seemed obvious in retrospect, but prior to the 3DO, there was genuine debate about whether consumers would pay premium prices for cutting-edge technology. The 3DO answered that question definitively. No, they would not. Future consoles would be priced aggressively, often at or below manufacturing cost, with companies planning to recoup losses through software sales and licensing fees. Sony's pricing strategy for the PlayStation was directly informed by watching the 3DO struggle. Sony could have launched at $300 or even $450 based on their manufacturing costs, but they chose $290 specifically to undercut competitors and remove price as a barrier to adoption. Sony was willing to take losses on hardware because they understood the long-term value of an installed base. Microsoft would follow this same strategy when launching the Xbox in 2001, pricing it below cost to establish market presence. The multi-manufacturer model, which had seemed so promising, was thoroughly discredited by the 3DO's failure. Every subsequent console generation featured single manufacturers controlling both hardware and software. Sony made PlayStations, Microsoft made Xboxes, Nintendo made its various platforms. The idea of licensing a platform to multiple hardware manufacturers was dead for gaming consoles, though it continued to work in other markets like the PC industry and Android phones. The 3DO proved that multimedia convergence, while theoretically appealing, wasn't enough to sell a gaming console. Consumers bought game consoles primarily to play games, and additional features like CD playback or video CD support were nice bonuses but not primary purchasing motivations. This lesson would be relearned periodically, with Sony trying to position the PlayStation 3 as a multimedia device, and Microsoft emphasizing the Xbox One's TV integration, only to find that gamers wanted gaming first and foremost. However, the idea that consoles could be entertainment hubs survived and eventually succeeded once the technology and market were ready. The PlayStation 2's DVD playback capabilities helped drive its adoption, and modern consoles like the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X serve as streaming media devices, Blu-ray players, and gaming machines simultaneously. The 3DO was ahead of its time with this concept, but execution and timing matter as much as vision. The 3DO's emphasis on CD-ROM proved prescient. While the 3DO itself failed, the transition from cartridges to optical discs happened exactly as Trip Hawkins predicted. The PlayStation cemented CDs as the medium for gaming. The Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, Xbox and GameCube all used optical discs, and it would be decades before digital distribution finally displaced physical media entirely. The 3DO was right about the future of game storage. It just couldn't capitalize on being right. The system's struggles with 3D graphics highlighted the importance of dedicated 3D hardware, something the 3DO lacked. Subsequent consoles invested heavily in custom GPUs designed specifically for 3D rendering. The PlayStation, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and all later systems included sophisticated 3D acceleration hardware. Software-based 3D rendering, which the 3DO relied upon, was recognized as insufficient for the performance gamers demanded. This pushed the industry toward more specialized, powerful graphic solutions. The 3DO's failure also demonstrated the importance of first-party software. Nintendo succeeded by creating iconic franchises like Mario, Zelda, and Metroid. Sega had Sonic. Sony would develop franchises like Gran Turismo, God of War, and Uncharted. These first-party titles gave platforms identity, drove hardware sales, and ensured minimum software quality. The 3DO lacked exclusive first-party franchises that people bought the system specifically to play, leaving it dependent on third parties who eventually abandoned it. Trip Hawkins' vision of games as art, which he had championed at Electronic Arts and carried into the 3DO project, did eventually prevail. Modern games are recognized as creative works, game developers are celebrated as artists, and the industry has matured into a respected entertainment medium. While the 3DO didn't cause this shift, Hawkins' consistent advocacy for elevating gaming as an art form contributed to changing perceptions over time. The extensive use of full-motion video in 3D games, while often criticized, represented experimentation with interactive storytelling that would evolve into the cinematic games we see today. Modern games like The Last of Us, God of War, and Red Dead Redemption 2 feature Hollywood-quality cinematics and storytelling that would have been impossible without decades of experiments in combining video and gameplay. The 3DO's FMV games were crude early attempts at this fusion, and while many failed, they explored territory that future developers would refine. The emphasis on audio quality that the 3DO pioneered became standard in gaming. CD-quality sound, full orchestral scores, and extensive voice acting were rare before the 3DO but became expected features within a few years. The system demonstrated that audio was just as important as graphics for creating immersive experiences, and subsequent platforms invested accordingly. Modern game soundtracks are performed by orchestras and composed by acclaimed musicians, a direct evolution from what the 3DO began. For Trip Hawkins personally, the 3DO's failure was a professional setback but not the end of his career. He left the 3DO company in 1999 and later founded Digital Chocolate, a mobile gaming company. His belief in interactive entertainment remained undimmed, and he continued advocating for gaming as a creative medium and viable entertainment industry. While the 3DO didn't succeed, Hawkins' broader vision of gaming's importance and potential was validated by the industry's growth into a $100 billion global market. The 3DO's legacy is also preserved by retro gaming enthusiasts and collectors. Modern fans have discovered the system's library and rescued games from obscurity. Emulators allow people to play 3DO titles without tracking down increasingly rare hardware. YouTube channels document the system's history, and forums discuss its games and technology. The 3DO has found a second life as a historical curiosity, a reminder of an ambitious attempt to revolutionize gaming that didn't work out but mattered nonetheless. Hardware enthusiasts study the 3DO's architecture as an example of early 32-bit console design and an interesting alternative approach to gaming hardware. The ARM processor choice, the custom graphics chips, the Opera operating system. These technical decisions represented thoughtful engineering that influenced later designs, even if indirectly. computer science students and gaming historians examine the 3DO to understand the technological landscape of the mid-90s and the trade-offs inherent in system design. As we reach the end of this journey through the 3DO's history, it's worth reflecting on what this expensive console represents in the broader story of gaming. The 3DO was a bet on the future that didn't pay off, a vision of what gaming could become that arrived too early and cost too much. It was a genuine attempt to revolutionize an industry that didn't want to be revolutionized in quite that way. And it was a reminder that in technology, as in life, being right isn't enough if the timing isn't right too. The $700 price tag was the defining characteristic of the 3DO, overshadowing its technical achievements and ambitious vision. That price point became a cautionary tale, a line in the sand that console manufacturers would reference for decades. When Sony priced the PlayStation 3 at $519 in 2006, critics immediately invoked the 3DO as a warning, and those concerns proved justified when the PS3 struggled initially against the more affordable Xbox 360 and Wii. Price consciousness in console gaming traces directly back to the lessons learned from the 3DO. The system also represents a road not taken, an alternate future where gaming platforms operated more like personal computers with open standards and multiple manufacturers. This model has proven successful in other technology sectors, but for gaming consoles the closed, controlled ecosystem model has dominated. Whether this is better for consumers, developers, or the industry as a whole remains debatable, but the 3D's failure ensured we would explore the closed model rather than the open one for at least another few decades. For those who owned a 3DO during its brief commercial life, the experience was mixed. There was the excitement of having cutting-edge technology, of playing games with CD-quality audio and impressive graphics, of being part of what seemed like the future of entertainment. But there was also the disappointment of watching support evaporate, of paying premium prices for a system that couldn't sustain itself, of feeling like you had bet on the wrong horse in the console wars. Yet many 3DO owners remember the system fondly despite its failure. The best 3DO games were genuinely excellent, and experiencing Need for Speed, Star Control 2, Wing Commander 3, or Return Fire at their peak was memorable. The system had character and ambition, qualities that sometimes matter more in retrospect than commercial success. The 3DO failed, yes, but it failed while trying to do something interesting, which is arguably more admirable than succeeding by playing it safe. For Trip Hawkins, the 3DO represents both a disappointment and a noble effort. He had already proven himself by founding Electronic Arts and building it into a powerhouse. With the 3DO, he tried something harder, creating a new platform that would change the rules of the game. It didn't work, but the attempt was worthwhile. The lessons learned from the 3DO's struggles informed better decisions later, both by Hawkins himself and by the industry that watched his experiment unfold. The gaming industry today looks nothing like what the 3DO envisioned, but also owes something to its experiments. We play games on CD-based systems, or their digital evolution. We expect cinematic presentation and CD-quality audio. We appreciate multimedia functionality in our consoles, and we benefit from lessons about pricing, market timing, and the importance of first-party software that the 3DO's failure taught. The system lost the battle but contributed to winning the larger war for gaming's legitimacy as an entertainment medium. If there's a message in the 3DO's story, it might be this: innovation requires risk, and not every risk pays off. The 3DO took massive risks with its pricing, its business model, its positioning, and its technology. Most of those risks didn't pan out, and the system failed commercially. But the willingness to take those risks, To try something different, to push boundaries, is what drives progress in technology and entertainment. We need companies and individuals willing to fail spectacularly while reaching for something better. The $700 console is gone, relegated to the dusty shelves of gaming history and the collections of enthusiasts. But its story remains relevant as a case study in ambition, execution, market dynamics, and the delicate balance between vision and viability. The 3DO asked the market to pay for the future before the present was ready to move on. The market declined, and in that decline lies lessons about patience, timing, pricing, and the gap between what engineers can build and what consumers will embrace. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of alternate timelines where the 3DO succeeded, where open gaming platforms became the norm, where multimedia convergence happened a decade earlier than it did. Or perhaps you'll simply appreciate the story of an ambitious failure, a reminder that progress comes from trying new things even when the outcome is uncertain. The 3DO dared greatly, failed publicly, and taught an industry lessons it needed to learn. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of the 3DO, the first $700 console, and a fascinating chapter in gaming history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into computing history, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share your thoughts below. Did you own a 3DO? Do you remember when it launched? What are your thoughts on the expensive gamble that defined a generation of gaming? But for now, rest easy. Let your mind wander through the dusty archives of forgotten technology, through the what-ifs and might-have-beens of computing history. The 3DO is gone, but its story lives on, a testament to ambition, vision, and the unpredictable path of technological progress. Sleep well and dream of better futures built on the lessons of fascinating failures. Good night.